Anyways, so for this, we'll just try to go quickly. I'm going to, I'll revisit some of the things I talked about last time too, just to make sure like the most important things are fully covered, and then I'll touch on a few new things I think are relevant. So are there any questions about the stuff before we get started? No? Okay. Cool beans. So then let's begin. Um Second. Okay. So first I want to make sure we're all on the same page about some of the local government stuff, the local governance stuff. So can somebody talk about what is the local competition system? How does it work? And especially, I want you to touch on where are there distortions? I want to make sure we're fully on the same page about that. Why might the local competition system distort people's incentives, distort local leaders' incentives? Anyone?
I mean, somebody I think took a shot at it.
What were you gonna say, Max?
I said I think it looks like somebody took a shot at it in the chat, but I was just gonna say, right, like the system is like the tournament style system. Everyone's basically competing based off of a mix of like economic metrics and certain things, which are like an auto, you don't get a promotion if you don't do them. So you get ranked by that. And like that's, in some ways very good because it aligns incentives. And it, if you really are trying to optimize for GDP, that's like, honestly, systems can do pretty well at that. But then problems start to arise when you get to think like externalities, right? So for example, pollution, right? Like this is a classic example, right? Where like the government measuring stations that like measure how much pollution you put out and that pollution level like determines whether you get promoted or not, right? Like you can put your polluting plants downstream of that measurement station, so the pollution runs into the neighboring local government's jurisdiction, and that's their problem. It's not your problem. Also like certain industries, which are industries that like agglomerate somewhere and don't agglomerate somewhere else, you can compete over those and reduce overall growth by trying to max out your own provincial growth.
Okay, so yeah, first thing, again, competition system. You have a bunch. This is the simple stuff. You got a bunch of different leaders. They have a goal: maximize GDP, and more recently, adding minimize pollution, things like that. They have a reason to fulfill that goal. They get promoted if they fulfill it. They get punished if they don't fulfill it. So they have a motivation to not only fulfill the goals but to specifically beat others. And so that leads to a lot of important distortions in their behaviors, both the idea of fulfilling one or two simple goals, and two, the idea of needing to beat the other people who are trying to fulfill those goals. So does anyone want to address the first one? What are the distortions of having goals like GDP targeting? Somebody raise your hand or do something. Fez, go ahead.
Doesn't it kind of make them neglect other things like education, for example, that aren't necessarily leading to like boosting GDP? So then I think pollution was also one up until like 2014 when the government started doing a crackdown. But I think like pollution up until 2014, education, and I think like other I can't think of other examples on top of my head, but I think like health or sanitation was also one. So
Okay, so yeah, a few things there. One is the idea of reducing things that are long-term benefits that won't really show up during your cycle of being promoted or being a leader. Like whether like a new factory or a new business will show up in your 5-10 years being a city leader. Education policy will affect people 30-40 years down the line in terms of their human capital, their productivity, stuff like that. So that's disincentivized pollution. Again, something that is not really GDP related. It's a classic externality, negative externality. So those are some things that'll be less focused on. Isha, what do you want to add?
I don't know if this is right, but I remember something about how actually I don't know if it causes negative things, but because like provinces are not incentivized to work together in any way, like a lot of resources are like very closely guarded. They'll put like factories and other things like very in the center of the province instead of anywhere near the outsides. I don't know if that has any negative consequences, but
Yes, that's a really important thing to remember. That's for the second point. The idea that it's not just they're trying to meet these one or two goals, it's that they need to beat the others. So there's much less incentives for helping each other out than there is, for example, between states. Like, you know, businesses or governments with between states in America. There's like, you're not trying to really compete with another state. So while you are elected by the people of your state and you want to serve the people of your state, you don't need to push down the people of another state necessarily. But in China, there is an advantage not only to rising, but to pushing other people, another state down. So that important factory example. Remember, this ties sort of into that whole grabbing hand and helping hand thing, which is an important thing to remember for the exam. Grabbing hand being more the idea of suppressing other people's, other states, other nations' abilities to put in their innovations and their companies into your area. So like, you know, messing with their permits, you know, like dragging your feet, making it so complicated for them. Helping hand is more in the vein of cultivating your own industries, giving them subsidies, giving them incentives, things like that. So you grow a competitors in infant industries and everything. Isha, did you want to add something else?
oh, I just wanted to clarify like my question was that so this is like a bad thing, the fact that they're competing with each other. Like, does it have any positive like so in general, the fact that everyone is incentivized to compete against each other, does it have more positive outcomes or negative outcomes? Like the grabbing versus helping hand thing.
So, wait, what?
I don't know if that makes sense, my question.
Yeah, did somebody else say something? No? What do you guys think about that? Are the effects overall positive or negative?
I mean, like China has been the fastest growing country in the world for like what 35, 40 years. So I feel like, you know, it's clearly worked to a certain degree.
Yeah, so kind of to Max's point, it's the idea of there's a trade-off here. The system makes leaders very focused on things that you kind of want leaders to focus on, especially from an economic point of view. You want them to focus on economic growth. But then the trade-off is, in order to get them, like the method of getting them to focus on these things is by definition an exclusionary one. It's that there's only a few promotion slots and you want them to want to win one of those promotion slots. So that means they have to be competing with each other. You can't, it's not like Harvard where you can give A's to everyone and have promotion inflation. You need to have them compete aggressively for their slots. So there is that disadvantage, but it's a trade-off with the sort of like growth mindset that Max is touching on. The last thing I want to touch on relevant to the exam is the specifically surrounding the, not the necessarily the distortions of what it reduces. We talked about it reduces work on education, healthcare, environmental pollution stuff until recently. What will it increase? What will it distort local governments into doing more of than they probably should be, perhaps, or wouldn't naturally be doing? Robert?
My guess is maybe property. I remember earlier in the term they talked about how a lot of China's GDP is made up of investment into real estate, and you run into kind of an issue where not if not all of that investment into real estate is actually driven by demand, and it's actually just speculation.
Yes, so having too much like housing and real estate and stuff like that, because again, the whole system is underpinned by this weird relic of the, like when China was actually a communist country, of having land not be owned by people. It's leased by people for like, 70-year contract or something in that vein. And then it is actually the state's land ultimately. So the state has been able to, the local governments have been able to make a killing and really fund these incentives for other industries and other sorts of infrastructure and everything by selling land to be developed by property developers and all that sort of stuff. And then we've seen how those property developers go in debt, and then that's recently caused some problems. But having so much housing, such that there's even like, you know, these whole like ghost town things in China where there's just no one living in these massive property complexes. So that is something where it's not necessarily suppressing it, it's actually, this is distorting it in a positive way, not as in an increasing way, increasing housing, increasing property. Okay. Last few questions on this. How is this affected, this sort of structure? It involves devolving a lot of power to the local and provincial authorities. How has that affected the geography of those provinces and those localities? How do you think? Like, what do you remember from class? I will send a recording if it updates in time. Imran. Does anyone remember anything in their review about the geography effect? Isha?
This might be wrong, but I remember something about how the capitals are like usually in the center of the provinces, or like actually never mind, maybe that's wrong.
I think you're on the right track. So if you remember from class, there was a brief discussion about how, like, research on where the capitals ended up. Fez, do you want to take something from that?
Oh, I mean, I think Isha saying this kind of reminded me of it. Isn't it that like they usually don't locate a lot of the big firms by like the borders of the provinces because they don't want there to be spillover effects into other provinces, and then they can like benefit from that level of innovation. So that way they try to keep everything kind of central.
That is an important thing to remember. That's a separate study, but that's an important thing to remember. Like, again, it ties so much into this idea of you're competing with others. You don't want to be employing people who aren't even within your province in your new high-tech factories. You'd rather it be your people that are getting those jobs and your surrounding businesses that are benefiting from the network effect. So consider that part of it. That's an important thing to remember. Jessica, what do you have to add?
I think I'm piggybacking off of the other two, but is it the idea of like redistricting? Like when they realized that originally some cities or firms that were in the middle of a province, they were getting a lot of great resources from the government and things like that, but suddenly when provinces had to be redistricted and then it ended up like splitting through and they ended up on the edges, they received far less benefits than before.
Wait, can you repeat what you said? Sorry, in one sentence.
Redistricting had revealed the effect of a firm's location, originally with a lot of resources in the center of a province, and then versus later when it was at the edge, it was becoming more neglectful and there was not as
Yep.
much like rules and regulations.
Okay, so that's touching more on specifically Fez's point, which is again, this is one you should know for your exam. Again, the idea of, and then this is somewhat logical. If you want you to beat your neighbor, you need to keep the jobs and the network effects and everything where it will only benefit your people and not be benefiting others. The last thing I'll touch on, which goes to Isha's original point, is the idea in the research that, I mean, in class that was discussed of where these capitals are. Like, you know, for a long time, these provinces haven't changed that much. They're mostly have been consistent. But what has really changed, not necessarily really changed, but what has sometimes changed is where these capitals, these leadership positions are located. Because there's two opposite forces. There's the force Isha talked about, which is keeping things in the center of the province, making sure they have administrative access of information of all the localities within the province. And then there's the other force of keeping it closer to like Beijing, closer to where the national government is, so that there is, you know, they're not getting too far away. They have a lot of connections with the national thing. So it's both, it's like kind of optimizing the location. This sort of the paper showed this, not perfectly, but sort of having an optimal location that is both close to everything within your province, all those smaller level governments, but also close to the national government. Nathan, we'll touch on AI-tocracy in a bit. Okay. So, and if you can all turn your cameras on, that would be good. So that should be, I think, most things on local government. I do want to talk a bit more about state capacity and the promotion system. So somebody explain to me what state capacity is, and explain to me also what role the promotion system has in Chinese state capacity.
I think state capacity was like the ability to do things, to do the right thing, and then like to do the thing right or something like that. And that the role of like personnel management, I guess, in state capacity is that the central government is essentially like responsible for like top-down employment of all of the local and like intermediate governments.
Yes. So really think again about state capacity. Firstly, it's about the state. It's about what the state is capable of doing and how effective they are at realizing their vision, realizing what they want to get done, getting it done. And that's what you need to understand. And then exactly what Natalie said in the vein of the promotion system is really important because it lines the incentive as it makes the lower level officials want to do what you want them to do and makes them effective, makes them the tip of the spear. So you have an idea. If you didn't have this promotion system, your idea is a lot less likely to get executed. But with the promotion system, local officials are more wanting to realize and do exactly what Xi Jinping wants, and care less about corruption and other things potentially because they get benefits from listening to Xi Jinping. Robert, do you want to add something?
Oh no, you said it.
Okay,
Thanks, man.
sorry. So that's the idea of state capacity. How might, like I said, how this might distort away from corruption, sort of, or sort of like nepotism, corruption, like those kind of things when you have these metrics. But how might corruption and nepotism, things like that, still play a role in the promotion system? Anyone remember from class?
I think Princeling's land like generates more revenue than non-Princeling's land.
Yes, so consider the role that corruption still has in China. There was that research about like the princelings, like I don't remember the study perfectly, but the ultimate conclusion, you should go back and look at it, was in the vein of that there was more benefits given to the people who are the children of important people. So that's one thing to understand. And then in the other side of it, you should make sure you understand, sorry, one second. Think about, and I want somebody to answer this question. How would you measure whether people in government are connected to people in industry or people in, like there's some sort of corruption happening? How would you measure that? What would you look for? That like some local leader is getting a little bit of a something on the side. What evidence would you look for? Ty?
There was a compliance study that basically showed that after the death, after like a worker accident at a firm, if they had politically connected people running the firm, their alpha, like their returns above normal, dropped because like indicating that they had been receiving some sort of help politically.
Okay, yes. So can you explain that one more time? And do you remember what lecture it was in?
Yeah, I think it was in crony capitalism. But basically, the idea is that they took firms that had executives that were connected to the state, and they looked at what happened to these firms' returns compared to firms that didn't have executives connected to the state after a worker accident, so like the death of a worker. And it showed that like after the death of a worker, executives left and their returns dropped, which you could use to infer some sort of causation between higher returns and having well-connected executives. Also, just because like the price of compliance Like clearly, if they were well connected, they didn't have to follow as many compliance rules or something like that. That was sort of like, I think, the context, but correct me if I'm wrong.
Okay, I think that's the general gist of it. I don't remember every specific of the paper. You should go and look at that side, but I think you explain the important details of it. Important to understand is like those methodology approach to how to look at whether there's that sort of cronyism or that corruption going on. That method, and having in your mind some other alternatives, like looking at whether there's some sort of like hiring of family members or things like that. Like think about all those other ways that it's possible to measure something that generally isn't easy to measure. Last thing I want to touch on vis-a-vis state capacity. Does anyone have any questions about state capacity or local authorities or anything yet? No? Okay. Last thing I want to touch on vis-a-vis state capacity. And this is a really important concept for the exam and just in general for the course, is the idea of policy experimentation. That's a big part of the course. Talked about it a lot. So can anyone give me a brief rundown? What does China do with policy experimentation? Do they do a lot of it, a little of it? What does that look like in China? Okay, let's hear from Robert.
Isn't the policy experimentation where they have the local governments try out different policies, and depending on how they work, the central government will implement them on a larger scale?
Yep, that's the general idea. So local and provincial governments try out a policy, some new government thing, they're kind of assigned to do it. And then if it works out, if like the research shows that it was working pretty effectively at whatever variable they were trying to improve, then they will expand it to a larger system. Does anyone have anything to add to that?
Wait, has that changed with Xi Jinping? Because I know when I had to write some of the response papers, they talked about how Xi Jinping was kind of undoing the policy experimentation and is kind of a like top bottom approach and stuff. So would you agree with that, or is that not really the case?
I wouldn't agree with the idea that it's gone, and I would still consider it a very important part of the way China works. Because again, it was kind of to the core at how the Chinese like devolved system works. Just like the tournament system, they also had this like almost tournament of policy experimentation system. And perhaps it's taken a step back from its heyday in the 90s and the 2000s, where it was a bulwark of many major decisions. But I'd still say it's important. And the last thing I would say, just and not to push back, but I would make sure you consider that this is a flexible thing. It's like the tournament system. Like the central government, like the theme here, just like with the tournament system, is we have an idea of what we want. We have a general idea of some new policy we want to implement, but we don't want to tell you exactly how that policy should be implemented exactly. We want you to kind of figure out what works for your area, figure out what kinks, like, if there's kinks, can you iron them out quickly? And you're incentivized to do it, again, because of the promotions. So consider both the tournament system and policy experimentation as this more flexible way of having localities use their creativity, figure things out, and then reading the data, reading the tea leaves, and figuring out whether it can work at a national stage. Okay, the last question I have is, Robert and then Fez.
Just trying to like marry this concept together. Would you kind of describe that as like similar to the concept of subcontracting, like giving those high level goals out and seeing how those experiments go?
Yes. So subcontracting is basically the more general term that'll encompass a lot of these things. Again, the idea of just kind of delegating these things. But again, don't get too wrapped up in like the idea of subcontracting. Like it's not like here's a specific thing you need to do, get these exact specifications done, implement this policy word for word. Again, it's more flexible than that. That's the key thing to understand of what subcontracting applies in this context. Fez and then Max.
Yeah, so I just had two quick questions. The first one is, so I know that like you just touched upon this, and I think Professor Yang also talked about this, that they kind of have localities try the experiment in their own way, in a way that like is most applicable for that region. But I guess my question then is like, how vague are the directions that they're kind of disseminating among these localities? Like, don't they kind of have to give them a set of instructions, or is it literally just here's the outcome, figure out like how to get there?
Okay, that's a great question. I know a little bit about this. 'Cause I remember, I think my first response paper was about this. There's a decent amount of stuff you can read about this. It's actually really, really vague in many instances. When the policy experimentation side, it's usually a bit more specific. Like, here's some money, or here's something we want you to more specifically get done. It's not like very vague. That's more specific. But here's kind of a general way we want you to take stuff. That's incredibly vague, usually in China, and in many things in China. Again, there's a lot of variance. Sometimes it's specific, sometimes it's not. But like, for example, if you look at like Xinjiang, there has not been any like directive, at least until in the last year or two, really, about Xinjiang from the national government. All it was Xi Jinping. This is kind of how it works. Xi Jinping makes a private speech to some like leaders within the party or something like that. A transcript of this speech is taken. His speech is like a normal speech. It's full of rhetoric. It's like a Joe Biden speech or whatever. It's like it's just a speech. It's full of rhetoric, stuff like that. Transcript is taken. Some censors, not like public censors, but like different types of censors, they remove or change a few things. They like will remove some stuff he says to the high level officials. Then they will reproduce the speech for lower level officials. And then the lower level officials, they have to read between the lines of those speeches. They have to be like, hey, I think when he says this thing about terrorism in China, he's probably meaning we should increase our police presence in Xinjiang or something like that. Like, they have to read between the lines and kind of figure it out. It's really vague sometimes. So that's just something you might want to consider. I don't know if I can check that. I don't think it will be a major part of this exam, but it's a good thing to keep in the back of your head if it comes up on a short answer question.
Okay,
What
cool.
was the
And
other
then
question?
yeah, first of all, thanks actually so much for that really thorough answer. The second question I had was, so I know Robert just asked about like subcontracting, and I remember like when that was coming up in the lecture, I think I might have been conflating like the examples that Professor Yang was talking about with like its actual application of the course. I just want to make sure. So when we talk about subcontracting, are we exclusively talking about when the central government basically subcontracts to local governments, or are we also thinking about like when firms are kind of brought in to subcontract as well?
You should check me on this, see if there's anything specific in the slides that contradicts what I'm about to say, just in case. But to my understanding, especially relevant to the exam, you can consider in both veins, because again, these are state-owned enterprises. There is delegation to them too. The most important vein to consider, administrative key, their subcontracting is in the vein of local, like, province to local governments or national to provincial governments and stuff like that.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much.
Max?
Sorry, my question was actually pretty similar to the one that just got answered. So no
Okay,
worries.
cool beans. Let's move on then. The last thing I want to talk about vis-a-vis policy experimentation is how China selects these locations. So we in class saw some research on this. Does anyone remember where does China do these policy experiments and why? Ty? You were raising your hand? No? Oh, okay. Gabe?
There was like a Eastern and an urban bias, right? It like roughly followed with the places that are already doing better in China.
Okay, and just a quick reminder, let's hear from Sean. Why is the Eastern and areas, what is the difference between them and the Western areas? I know this is kind of simple, but.
Sorry, can you repeat your question? I just got back in my room.
What is the difference between the Eastern areas of China of the Western areas? Just like run down a few important things.
Essentially, like everything is in the East. Like everything was like very economically, I guess like valid, or not economically. I don't know how to phrase it, but like the central point of like economic China is like towards the East, whereas like the West is like the rural areas and such.
Yes, so that's the most basic division. You guys saw that line that was split China in like half, but size-wise, but split it into like 94% in the East, 6% of the population in the West, population-wise. So much huge urban bias, huge population bias to the East. that's relevant, hint, when it comes to like the way ethnic minorities operate in China versus the US. Again, in China, there's smaller groups than in the US, but they're less intermingled. They're like dominant in certain regions, so like in Xinjiang and Tibet and stuff like that, in Hong Kong, somewhat in Taiwan, definitely, if you want to consider that. It's not really an ethnic minority, but still an important difference. So there's that. Then there's also the reason for that, like probably the biggest one is the waterways, the navigable lengths of the Yangtze and Yellow rivers, as well as, obviously the ocean and the ports that form there in the century of humiliation and the colonial period and all that sort of stuff. So considering all of that is important. And then now bringing it back to what Gabe was talking about, those areas are they're the urban areas, they're the trading areas, they're where all the big businesses are. Those areas, they're the richer areas of the situation. So they're the richer and more urban areas. And as Gabe was saying, slight bias towards policy experimentations in those regions. So why is that? Why would that be? Again, you guys can take a guess at this one. Robert?
Wild guess. I know those areas have kind of served as the main economic growth engines of the country, and probably Chinese leaders are thinking of how they can continue to propel that growth.
Yes. So part of the thing is, like, when they're thinking of where to experiment policies, they are biased towards the places they actually care about the growth, or they want some industrial thing to succeed or whatever. Also, they're thinking about the future. They want other places across the country to look like these places. So if you want a policy that'll last, make sure it works in the places that are most at the cutting edge. So that's part of it. Other parts of it are just considering, many of their like closer allies are going to be in that region. That's really important in the Xi Jinping era, where alliances and loyalty to Xi and his allies is extremely important relative to previous governments. It's also important to consider that these areas are often going to be having better infrastructure, already better data tabulation things from like a structural point of view, from a research point of view. You might trust these officials more to get things done properly for the experiment, to figure it out, to be creative. You might trust these officials to record things properly and to implement things properly. So there's that angle too. So you should consider that part of it. I would personally revisit that section in lecture because it's relevant to the exam, the policy experimentation stuff, and make sure you understand the studies, the studies about where experimentation is done, what biases there are they adjusted for, are they addressed, things like that. Make sure you understand that segment of it. But for now, let's move on. Are there any questions about anything there? No?
I
Does
don't
anyone-
fully understand like why you would want to try these policies in places that are like already experiencing a ton of growth, because like when you expect growth to sort of like plateau at a certain point in places that are already like super industrialized, like I don't understand how it's not low-hanging fruit to sort of invest in more rural regions.
Oh, that's a great question. And I think there's a few parts to it. The first is to understand where China is, in the sense that quite a lot of the country is growing. It's just some parts are growing faster than others. And especially, and again, you should read the paper because I can't explain it perfectly off the top of my head, but you should consider some policies, you care about them benefiting like certain industries, like certain industrial policies. Other policies, like you care about them really sharpening the tip of your country's economic engine. You want, like, if it's an industrial policy about like chips or semiconductors, they're not going to bother trying those out in places that it's less likely to work or less likely to be effective. They're going to want to make it maximally effective, even if it doesn't scale up to the national level. Because, like, again, these are still policies. They're not just experimentations. They're also real policies that'll be put in place for millions of people. Second, again, consider the idea of infrastructure to get things done effectively. You trust the officials, or maybe you're just, those officials are loyal to you or their friends, and you trust them to get it done, to actually see out the vision of the policy, and you trust them to tabulate things, and you can get a good picture of it. And third, again, remember the division of China is that, again, everything's going towards these urban areas. So there's a reason you'd want to be biased in terms of investing in rural areas. The sorts of investments you would do in rural or more developing China, they'll probably are still happening. Again, this isn't a hard and fast rule. This is just a bias. It's not an absolute statement. But a lot of the policies the national government is interested, like vis-a-vis high-speed rail or things like that, they don't really apply so much to those areas. And those kind of areas, they need a different set of policies about education, about healthcare. We talked about, escaping the middle income trap, using higher education, better human capital. Those are a different suite of policies. So it's important to consider that, one, it's not a hard and fast rule. Two, these areas, these richer areas have better ability to execute and they have more friends, better tabulation. And three, the policies that apply to the urban areas are going to apply to a lot of China. Policies that apply to very poorer and more Western areas are probably going to be fairly regionalized anyway. So the central government's not really experimenting with them as much, but there still are experiments there. Isha, what do you want to add?
Just super quickly, I know we probably have to move on, but you said earlier about something about in the Xi Jinping era, loyalties are important.
Mhm.
What is loyalties to who? What's alliances? Are they countries or alliances or people or?
Yes. So the Xi what I was getting to is the idea that the Xi Jinping era of Chinese government, especially in the last few years, again, China's government is very non-transparent. So many of these are just speculation by Westerners, but there's a widespread belief that it's a much more loyalty-driven system, in the sense that people need to bend the knee and they need to kiss the ring of Xi Jinping, first and foremost, and of some of his senior friends and stuff like that in the Politburo, something driven more by your loyalty to Xi Jinping. For example, a lot of the discussion at the meeting, the CCP conference, the 5-year meeting, 2 months ago now, was about how the members chosen for the Politburo Standing Committee, the most senior people, they're all intense Xi loyalists, the sort of people who were there beforehand, the sort of people who might disagree with him. They weren't chosen. People like the mayor of Shanghai, who didn't do a good job by a lot of metrics, by measures of his COVID effectiveness, stuff like that. But he's really loyal to Xi and he knows Xi well and stuff like that. So loyalty is being a more useful thing. You want to be really loyal to your superiors. You want to do exactly what they want, and especially you want to be loyal to Xi Jinping nowadays.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Cool beans. Let's move on then to industrial policy. So quickly again, what is industrial policy? And why does China's local governments want to do it? And then we'll talk about why China's national governments want to do it. So what is industrial policy and why are local governments interested?
It's like you said before, if everyone's competing to have a lot of GDP growth in their specific area, then policy that can boost industry in your area is very important.
Yes. So again, it's kind of splitting that into grabbing hand, helping hand. You can do industrial policy by helping hand, helping your own industry, subsidizing them. Again, local governments control a lot of land, so giving them access to land at a lower rate or for free. Saying that you'll support housing projects to make sure their workers have places to live, reforming your hukou system. Remember hukou, so that those companies can get workers, all that sort of stuff. So again, all these ideas connect together, and that's why it's so important to understand the local devolution of power, the competition system, because so many of these other things are branched off of that umbrella, that tree. That's not really an umbrella. So exactly what Gabe said, from the helping hand and then also grabbing hand, wanting to make it somewhat harder for other people to compete in that thing. So that's why localities are interested. They want leaders want to win the competition. They want to grow fast, and that means they need cutting edge industry. They need better industry. They want to subsidize it. They want companies to build more fancy stuff there, in their localities and in their provinces. Okay, why does the national government care about industrial policy? What do you think, Max?
Well, actually, this is a question, not about this.
Go
About
ahead.
the previous thing. So I mean, like, that makes total sense, like the grabbing hand stuff. Like, I get it broadly. I guess it's more of a comprehension question. Why does like if all the local governments are still overseen by like a provincial authority, doesn't that provide like a degree of check on their like ability to steal growth from each other? Because the provincial head is still going to be like, I have to max out my GDP targets. And that requires like some degree of you guys not screwing each other over.
Yes, that is a great point, and that's going to happen. So that, like, again, like, that's one thing to remember with a lot of these research papers that are like showing that there's like levels of competition, is that it's not like it's again like a hard and fast rule, just like the policy experimentation thing. There's forces moving in opposing directions, and I would agree with you. Again, I don't have data to support this. I'm sure that if things got too far, there's going to be like some guy from on high is going to be like, hey, you need to stop doing this. You're actually causing more problems than you're solving. At the same time, some of the biggest competitions are going to be province versus province and stuff like that. And then the only really power higher than that is the central, the like national government, which will only will only intervene sometimes because again they like the competition thing. They're fine tolerating some level of inefficiencies because of the other benefits they see the competition system bringing them. So there's trade-offs there. So provinces leaders would do the same for local leaders to a certain extent. Again, I don't have data to support that exactly, but I would go and read that paper or review that lecture, especially specifically on the border like placement of border counties versus central counties of provinces and stuff like that, and seeing what they had to say about that. Okay, so why do national governments care about industrial policy? Let's hear from Nathan.
Oh, can you repeat the question?
Why do national governments care about industrial policy?
National governments care about industrial policy. Well, I mean, a lot of reasons would include competition with international industries, like for example, the EV industry. The national government's going to want to support a lot of their local EV companies and factories because they see it as a potential way to gain dominance internationally. The same story for what was the other one, like AI as well, similar story.
So yeah, so most important thing is again considering the idea of, well, when are you going to do it? You're going to do industrial policy when it will give you a comparative advantage where you can benefit, you can reap the rewards, and somebody else won't take the rewards from it. So for example, again, we talked about the example that the United States doesn't do industrial policy on the code that goes into AI, at least not so far. Maybe they will, because it's, at least from this explanation, this standpoint, industrial policy doesn't give you a comparative advantage on code because code will just go everywhere unless you somehow lock the key of the code and protect it, which is very difficult. But AI hardware, the NVIDIA graphics chips, those kind of things, those are very easy, relatively speaking, to protect because you just don't sell the chips there. It's not like code, it's not floating around the internet. If your facilities to manufacture graphics cards and manufacture AI chips is in your country, well, then the other place doesn't have access to them, and you get to choose how much access they have. So it gives you a comparative advantage in that situation. So consider industrial policy. There's many reasons to have it at a national level, but consider especially relevant to China is what Nathan was saying in the vein of giving you comparative advantages in artificial intelligence and those kinds of things, and generally just giving you some sort of leg up, either by boosting your own industrial capacity, boosting innovation, things like that, and especially by doing it in a way that is not just going to eventually quickly become somebody else's benefit too. Like the US can't just take your technology, take your code, and replicate it themselves. So two sides of the same coin, but important to understand both motivations. Does that make sense for industrial policy? Okay, so then let's move on. Speaking of artificial intelligence, let's talk a bit about technology, innovation, and artificial intelligence. So, Nathan, also, I guess, again, you were the one who had the question about AI-tocracy.
Yes, maybe.
Did you?
This
No?
is true, unless there's the other Nathan. Is he here?
Do you have a question about AI-tocracy or not?
No.
No, okay, never mind. So, did anyone else have a, oh, okay, somebody tested that. Anyways, let us talk about the general idea of that paper and the relevance of it to technology in China. So firstly, the key thing of AI-tocracy, which I think is a cool name for a paper, is the theme is understanding the role of the state, the Chinese state, in technological developments, not just through industrial policy, but through its own interests. And the idea of the paper is saying, well, hey, the Chinese government has an idea, it has an interest in cultivating these, like, for example, like camera recognition, artificial intelligences, and these surveillance AIs and all that sort of stuff, because it can be useful for them. It can be useful for them to keep their state capacity, to keep their control over the population. Now, the paper is more about like surveillance artificial intelligence technologies, but we've talked about in section how that could easily be expanded. Like we talked then about natural language models, and you probably since then you might have played around with ChatGPT or something since then. I hope you can see how those could be very capable of being a much more effective censorship or propaganda machine than anything previously available. But that paper was made before this, and it was about surveillance technology. So what are the main takeaways of that research? Tomoki, do you remember? No?
I feel like there's like a general connection between the fact that the state government of China wants a lot of data and the fact that like AI companies can provide that data. So there's like a mutually beneficial relationship there.
Yeah, so that is a general thing that makes it more feasible in China. Important to understand in the background that, well, China is a place that it doesn't have a lot of privacy constraints. It's not like America. There isn't activist groups that'll push back on it. There's not really like a strong culture of privacy. The state is powerful. The state collects a lot of data, and data is useful for artificial intelligence. Companies are interested in that data. They want to use that data. So they want to play ball with the government often, so that they can get access to that data and use it for other purposes. So that was an important finding, that companies that worked with the centralized governments not only worked on projects for the centralized government, they used either the experience or potentially even the data from that encounter to build consumer or commercial or enterprise products that were separate. Important finding from that paper. Okay, who wanted to add something? That was one of the three important things. Okay, Ashley, what are you saying?
Wait, I checked that too because I didn't want to say out loud, but I think wasn't one of the points that like after periods of unrest or like political sort of flares, I suppose like local authorities will use AI technology to like survey their population more. Like we see like spikes in that, I think.
Yes, so Natalie told us the first important relationship about how companies that get these contracts for the government also end up boosting their success in the private sphere too. Second major observation, and the third one are very closely related. The second one is what Ashley said. There is the company. I'm sorry. There's a city or a province, or say a city. They have their AI stuff is going on fine. Not really any major changes. Then they get time point zero. They get a big protest or some sort of instability or social unrest event, and we see that after those events, there is a significant increase in procurement of these surveillance-based artificial intelligence things in the immediate time periods after that. So that's the key relationship there. It's logical, it makes sense, it's just important to understand that. It's also important to understand the reverse, which is the third part of the puzzle. The idea that when you have those higher levels of surveillance, when you have those increased procurement, you see a reduction in the amount of protesting as a consequence. They seem to be effective at deterring that sort of stuff. So again, go and review that one. That's an important one, alongside a few that I mentioned before, like the Hong Kong protests, both those papers on that, the papers on the border versus center of a province industrial policy, the paper on policy experimentation. Those are some of the really important ones to review, and this one is particularly important. So it goes both ways. Unrest causes more procurement of surveillance AI, but more surveillance AI controlled for other things causes a reduction in unrest and in violating what the government wishes in that regard. Robert?
Yeah, I cut out for a second. Could you just walk through those different sources you recommend us walk through, us review before the exam? Sorry about that.
Okay, I will. This is an incomplete list, but I will just mention a few off the top of my head. AItocracy, that's really important. The Hong Kong, both the papers, both about first about people, whether they go to protest, the strategic complementarity versus substitutability thing. Like, remember the ultimate thing was, I think it found that it was strategically substitutable was the dominant factor, in the vein of, their perceptions before the protest versus the actual overall protest rate and whether that led to them going to the protest or not. I'll try to explain that a bit if we have time, but you can go read that. The other one was about network effects in Hong Kong. Whether when you're with your friends around a lot of people who went to protest the previous year, you're more likely to go the next year. So those social network effects. The paper about policy experimentation, where is it done? Why is it done in certain regions or not? How does China adjust for that sort of thing? So understanding that at a deeper level, understanding the research on local government and distortions that has. Does that lead to business in the center of provinces, at the borders of provinces? Why not? Because it's a competition system and you don't want to give benefits to your competitors. Also understand the Princeling research and other sorts of research that is about who benefits. Like, for example, also the Princeling research and the research on like the deaths, like what companies get hurt because somebody dies or gets injured on their plants, what companies don't get hurt. And what does that have to do with corruption or cronyism or stuff like that? Okay, Max, what's your question? Max?
I'm sorry, I keep losing my cursor keeps disappearing for like a second.
No worries.
Okay, question on this, this is more broad study question. If we understand the papers that he wrote the email about, plus some of the papers you just chatted about really well, is that going to be like a much better use of our time than like going through all of the slides?
The papers, I would say, understanding them are going to be high bang for buck. If you just understand the research there, and more importantly, understand the big thematic connection to local governance, to industrial policy, like what those implications are. Again, I would like I'm making this review as helpful as possible. But I would still recommend glancing through the slides, especially in places that I'm mentioning, like, for example, the policy experimentation stuff, the crony capitalism stuff, some things like that. The ones that are more specific, where there were like specific concepts laid out, like in terminology, like make sure you understand grabbing hand, helping hand, make sure you understand the specific effects of the one child policy. That's another thing, the research on the one child policy. There's a important paper mentioned, I think, in the slides. So yeah, a few more specific topics. You don't need to review everything though. Understanding the papers is particularly important. Kaylin, then Ty.
Yeah, thanks. So I know you mentioned that there's a paper specifically about how local governments, when they do that whole helping hand, they like prefer the benefits don't really spread outwards toward the borders, and they're more concentrated. I couldn't find that paper exactly that says that. Do you know what that one was?
Does anyone remember what the paper was called, or what the research was called? Okay, if somebody can put it in the chat,
That might have just been slides. I don't know if we looked at a whole.
Okay, if you didn't look at a paper,
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
then you just need to understand that, like, again, I just want to make sure you, again, you don't need to read these papers. Read maybe AI-tocracy if you have a chance, but that's not essential. You just need to make sure you revisit the slides on it and you fully understand what the slides are telling you about it. And more importantly, you understand like the inputs, the outputs, and like the output variables, what is being read, and sort of what the graphs are telling you. You should be able to read the graphs, especially for AI-tocracy. Okay, Ty, what did you want to add?
Some of the tables are a little confusing to me. And I was wondering, can I give you an example of a table?
Yep.
So sorry, I'll just pull this up. So for example, slide 20 of policy experimentation, I can probably share my screen if you want me
Sure,
to.
go ahead.
So here, which I understand like the conclusion that
I can't see anything.
you can't see it. Really?
I don't know.
1 second. I can just share my whole screen as well. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So I understand the like the general conclusion here that there's an incentive to have a successful experiment because that will lead to your promotion, or that correlates with a promotion. But this table is confusing to me. One, it seems that there is a negative correlation between participation and experimentation, just all, regardless of whether or not they're rolled out, and your political promotion. But there are no numbers for like participation and experimentation rolled out.
My understanding is this is the pre-lecture slides. You should check the post-lecture slides. He
This was from,
probably
like,
had
the
some.
actual- I mean, this was
What?
from the actual paper. Like this is
This is from the paper.
Yeah, this was the table.
This was the table. Okay, I'll go try to go and look at this because I'm not exactly sure the context. Does anyone have an explanation that they've read this recently? No? Okay, I'll try to take a look at this after this, and I'll send something out if I find something specifically. Overall thing to understand is it'll be enough for this specific topic at least. Again, like AI-tocracy, Hong Kong protests, stuff like that, make sure you understand them deeper. But for this one, it's good enough to understand that the policy experimentation, where it's biased to, how that's adjusted for, and understanding that it is succeeding in that, taking that on and succeeding in that is something that's going to be under a lot of attention, a lot of scrutiny, and potentially lead to promotions. I'm not sure exactly what this is, so I will look into that.
Okay.
Okay. Cool beans? I know that wasn't a great answer, but is that okay?
Yeah, I mean there are a couple others that are sort of similar.
Okay, if we have time at the end, I can try to take a look at them, and I'll point out what's important to understand. Again, there's only a few that you really need to understand the deep aspects of like the relationships. Again, more important than like the regression tables are understanding any sort of graphs that are shown.
Yeah.
So Leah and then Fez.
Hi. Yeah, I just had a few quick questions. The first one is, maybe it's obvious I missed something, but I don't think I ever really understood the difference between the PRC and then the CCP, like in terms of functionality.
PRC is the state. It is the country, the People's Republic of China. The CCP is the party that is right now in power in the state, the Chinese Communist Party. I would say it's like the Democratic Party is in charge of the country as holds the presidency, but it's a one-party state in that there's no alternative. There's no Republican Party to take control. So the CCP is the PRC sort of, but like consider the PRC, the People's Republic of China, as the country, as the nation of China, and the CCP as the people in charge, the group, the party that's in charge.
Okay, but is it normal for like Xi Jinping, for example, or the premier to be both in charge of the CCP and the PRC?
Usually, yes. Usually the leader will hold both titles eventually. There's some times where that hasn't really happened. For example, like during the early years of Hu Jintao, the person who preceded Xi Jinping, his predecessor, Jiang Zemin, he held the kind of the party secretary title for a little extra time. Same with the famed Deng Xiaoping, who led the reopening of China to the West. He held, I think, the chairman of the party after he'd stepped down from leadership of the overall country. So there's been some times where that's not been true, but I'm not going to go too much into that. The other thing to touch on, but again, most of the time it will be the same person. The other thing to touch on is the important roles of Xi Jinping is he's the head of the party, he is the head of the country, and he's the head of the military. He's the chief of the military. And the key thing there is that the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, the Army of China, is not the country's army. It is the party's army. It is the CCP's own army, because it stems from the revolution and from the Civil War, that this is the Communist Party's army. So it's a bit of a weird thing to consider that a political party has an army, but that's technically how the structure works in China. Does that sort of answer your question?
Okay, and are there important implications to that? Because I mean, I assume like the CCP and PRC are generally in line. Except
Yeah,
for, like,
because the CCP controls the China. So just consider the PRC as the country. So it's not that the PRC is not that relevant of an institution because it doesn't have any like special people. It is all its people are the CCP's people. So just don't worry too much about the PRC as having any sort of unique things. Just think of China. The PRC, China, is just controlled by the Communist Party. The Communist Party has its own military that controls everything, that does everything, and all of it's led by Xi Jinping. It's not too relevant beyond that for now.
Okay, got you. And then can I ask another really quick question about a table? I just wasn't super clear about, or is there?
Let's try to do tables afterwards, because
Okay.
I want to make sure the stuff that I know will come up on the exam, those concepts are covered first. And I know that I don't think there's going to be any like table questions or anything, at least to my knowledge of looking at the exam. So Fez, what's up?
Sorry, I just had a quick question about like the structure of the exam. So I understand that there's like an hour that's closed book and then an hour that's open book. Is the closed book portion exclusively multiple choice, or is there a short answer on that as well? Or is the short answer section only in the open book? I don't know if you're allowed to touch
The
on that.
closed book is purely going to be multiple choice. The open book is purely going to be short answer. There are a decent amount of questions to answer in the short answer section, so you will not have time to be like looking everywhere and checking your sources and like trying to write the perfect essays and rereading papers. So again, that's why I'm telling you, make sure you're familiar with these few key papers I keep mentioning more than the other ones, so you can just write about them. Second thing is write short answers, write like 1 to 2 sentence answers to some of them. Don't write like long paragraphs because you will run out of time. There's a
are there like some questions where you're supposed to write more than others, and like would it tell us that, or should we just
yes, it'll generally be indicated for most of the questions though, unless it's indicated otherwise. Write short to the point answers. The questions are mostly going to be in the vein of either analyzing like a graph or analyzing some sort of research thing. There's an empirical questions. Again, that's why I keep referencing a few papers. And the other thing is explaining some sort of principle, like vis-a-vis like innovation or industrial policy or something like that. So that's why I keep asking you just to explain a few things. So as long as you understand the concepts, you'll be able to apply them to answer those questions probably reasonably well. Okay.
Thank you.
Quickly, Helen, and then Robert, and then we should get to the content review.
Just a quick follow-up on the structure. In terms of topics covered, can you clarify if we need to know like the last few topics that we discussed, like relating trading with the world, influencing those ones?
Yes, but not very extensively. They're not going to be the focus of the exam. Mainly, and I'll touch on this at the end, just understand basic ideas of how trade has shifted. Obviously trade connections have shifted towards China, away from America, more integrated into supply chains, what that sort of means, and what China's history is. The century of humiliation, the Middle Kingdom before then. Those are the important things to understand. Not much more than that.
Gotcha. And then one more question. I don't know if you'll get to this later, but if we have time, can you walk through? He had like a category of research methods that were in like an other category about OLS, probit, instrumental variable. Can you walk us through those if you have time?
Yeah, so if I have time, I'll try to go through a few relevant ones. Just quick off the bat, all you need to understand the basics of OLS. Just that's linear regression. It's just the idea of finding line of best fit. To explain, like you take some independent variable, you want to find some sort of simple line that predicts higher levels of this dependent variable. Independent variable predicts higher levels of the dependent variable. If it's a positive slope line, that makes sense. If it's a negative slope line, that's basically higher levels of the independent variable are predicting lower levels of the dependent variables, and you can plug in whatever there. I can explain that more later. Instrumental, yeah, we won't get into that right now. If I have time at the end. Okay.
So these won't
Yep.
be on the exam.
To my understanding, you won't need to have a super intricate understanding. I will, again, you need to make sure you just understand those relevant papers, their findings, and think about, especially understand correlation and causation for the empirical questions. Like, what can you say with confidence? Can you say correlation? Can you say causation? Think also about and make sure you understand like internal and external validity constraints. Like external validity being the idea that does your research apply elsewhere? Like, for example, if I conducted an excellent study on that only was on the preferences of ice cream flavors for people who are senior citizens, and I only surveyed people in nursing homes, well, I'm going to have an external validity constraint that it's not going to really apply much in allowing me to predict what 18-year-olds are going to choose as their favorite ice cream flavor, because they're not in the population that I studied. So that's external validity. And internal validity you consider just like constraints of whether you are actually finding what you think you're finding. Like, for example, that's where confounding variables come in. Is the reason that people who live in highly polluted areas, is the reason that they live shorter lives because they are getting exposed to pollution and dying? Or is it because only poor people live in polluted areas, rich people leave the pollution because they don't like it, and poor people for other reasons can't afford healthcare and stuff like that, and they die younger? So considering those kind of constraints as well.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay. Robert.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we're going to go over this in the content review, but I was kind of a little bit confused by the bonus question, the practice exam. I was wondering how you approach that.
The what?
The bonus question, the 5-point bonus question at the end of the practice exam.
I do not know. To my knowledge, there's no bonus questions on the real exam.
Yeah, no, but like just the question itself, how you approach that, the design your own experiment.
What is the question? I don't remember it off the top of my head.
Shit, I don't have it open.
Okay, we'll come to it later.
Yeah.
Oh wait,
Something
It's
about
about designing your own experiment.
okay. So for this test, there's not going to be much in that vein. It is important that it's more important that you're able to analyze the experiment and explain one of the few papers I've been mentioning a lot, explain what's going on. At least to my reading of the exam, I don't see any place where you're really going to have to design your own experiment. If you do, again, all you need to do is just think of what am I changing? What's my policy change? What's my independent variable versus the control group? Make sure you mention there's a control group, potentially a placebo group, but that's not really that important. But make sure you understand the placebo group from that Hong Kong study. Remember going onto a subway, taking photos instead of going to the protest, so that you would take out the bias towards people just want money rather than to actually go to a protest. Other thing is then just make sure you understand what you're measuring, what are the dependent variables, and what is your basic experimental protocol. We can talk briefly if you have time about those, but let's try to move on now because that's not going to be that important. Leah, do you have another question?
Oh no, sorry, I forgot to lower my hand. It was just about the tables. I'll
Okay.
ask at the end.
Cool beans. So let us move on to what was I going to mention? Something else about innovation. Okay, so what I wanted to bring up is I want to make sure we understand why innovation can end up differently. So innovation is not going to be like this uniform thing. Every country ends up innovating in the same way. Countries have different reasons to prioritize different technologies. Part of it ties again back to industrial policy, the comparative advantage angle. For like rival sectors where you can really develop that sort of insular comparative advantage, you might want to use industrial policy, or countries might consider using it. But things that'll diffuse easily, they're less interested. But another angle is to consider what will benefit the people in different regions. Like, for example, if you have a lot of land, you're not constrained by land when developing your agricultural system and innovating it. So your innovations are not going to focus on that. You might just be like, hey, let's just, we can have a lot of workers. Let's just make the workers able to, a lot of farmers can own their own land. Let's just make the workers a little bit better at having higher yields there or being more productive there. Versus in other places, you might consider things about, we have very little land to farm. So maybe we need to consider a different realm of innovation that is focused less about helping out workers or something that more about maintaining yields and stuff like that of my farms so that it's productive enough to feed my country and things like that. So I would, if you're reviewing the innovation slide, I'd make sure you understand how different properties of a country, different structural attributes of a country can lead to different innovation regimes. Based on what your country needs. Does it need to take care of a lot of land or a little land? Does it need to, do you have a lot of a good talented worker pool in your city for making glass or to making bicycles? And how that affects what sort of innovations and what sort of policies you will implement. I'm being a little vague there because I'm not gonna give away any answers, but I would make sure to go back and look at that in the innovation section. So any questions on innovation, AI, stuff like that? Cool beans.
Oh, wait,
Let
sorry.
us talk.
I have a
What?
quick question. What's the point? Like with when he was talking about the crossbow and Japan versus US agriculture innovation, my takeaway was that just AI is more compatible with authoritarian regimes. Is that generally the takeaway?
That I think is part of the route to take it.
I didn't see how that was relevant otherwise.
I think it's the two takeaways I would procure are first what you're saying, which is the idea that, hey, countries that have the sort of stuff to make some type of innovation work, the data, the control, the lack of privacy constraints, like in China, they might be able to take advantage of that technology, and the technology will naturally grow there easier. Other technologies will grow in other areas where under different conditions. The second takeaway is that even just within an area, some places are going to have certain other constraints, like the Japan thing. Can you explain that for a second to everyone?
Yeah, so I think in Japan it was space is more limited than just land is more expensive than human capital, whereas in the US it was the opposite. So humans invented kind of technology that made humans more productive on the farm rather than land more productive.
Where did they do that?
Sorry, where did they did that they made technology that made humans more productive in the US because human labor is more expensive than land, and then in Japan land is more expensive than humans or labor. So they made technology that was land efficient in Japan.
Yes. So that takeaway itself, I would also make sure you remember that, especially just understanding that it's often about limiting reagents. So if your constraint is the land and not the humans, well, then you are going to focus on making sure your limiting reagent is as productive as it can be, so it's worth the thing. It's like you want to make sure your land is productive enough to be worthy of being farmed by all the humans. If it's the other way around, that your humans are expensive and you have a lot of land, then you want to make sure the humans are really up to the task of producing a lot of the land, because they're the limiting reagent. They're the expensive ones, and that'll apply again to other sorts of industrial things, competition things within China. But make sure you just understand that general principle of like whatever is the limiting factor, you might want to invest in that and innovate in that, so that that you maximize the yield of the complementary effects of humans and land, or workers and factory, or something like that. Does that make sense?
Yes, but I didn't see like a limiting factor in China's case.
It's just I would just think about it in the sense of if you want to think about it in China's case, just understand it in the sense of like one city versus another city, the type of workers they have, the type of factories they have, what are you going to invest in for educational purposes, especially for what industries are you going to try to bring in, what innovations are you going to try to sponsor. That's part of it. From a national thing, just think about you have a lot of data. You have the easy access to that sort of thing. So you might invest in a different part of artificial intelligence, in the chip making or into the algorithm making or something like that, so you can fully exploit that data. Whereas in the US, you might have less of the data, so you might be investing more into that, or to procuring that data through other methods. Again, just understand the concept generally. If it comes up on the exam, I think you know enough at this point to be able to answer the questions.
Okay, thank you.
Kaylin?
No worries. So I think I know you said that one important paper was the autocracy one. So I thought it would be important to ask, like, what I know they talked about a connection between weather and like how that affects protest turnout. I'm not really clear on the experimental design, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit about like that weather part specifically.
Okay, so I'm gonna pull up that. How about I do that at the end, just so I can get through the rest of the stuff, and then I will talk about that one, because I need to look at the graph, but make sure I'm not explaining it wrong. If I remember correctly, the basic idea is that was their way of doing a control, but I will make sure about that before I tell you. Does anyone remember the exact specifics there? No? Okay, we'll touch on that.
I mean, yeah, thank you. I'll touch on it later.
Okay, so next I want to talk about inequality and mobility. So that's the sixth topic, inequality and mobility. So firstly, what is the middle income trap, and what is needed to help solve that in China, help overcome that in China? Okay, so let's hear from Anne. What's the middle income trap?
Okay, I'm not totally clear on this. But basically, like, countries that are not exactly like classified as poor or wealthy in the world tend to like not really rise to the status of being wealthy.
Yeah, so basic idea is, again, those countries that are in the middle, they're ones that are not, they don't have, again, GDP per capita is the key metric here. People in those countries aren't poor, they have like food, they're not going hungry, but they're also not rich. They don't get to go on like the number of like, do all the sorts of stuff Americans can buy and sort of gadgets and things like that America and many Westerners enjoy on average. So they're kind of in the middle, not poor, not rich. And the argument is, and this is again a trap, because growth stalls for countries with people in those middle incomes, that for some reason, some of the explanations are like deindustrialization, like premature deindustrialization, that they're losing their industrial engine before they really grow and have very high tech industries. Why is that? Again, like for like Brazil, stuff like that, the argument is, well, poorer countries like China before, Bangladesh, things like that, they are stealing the very low skilled labor because they can make stuff for cheaper. So Brazil ends up buying all those cheap industrial products. And then there is there's America and to a certain extent Europe, which make all the high tech products, and then they just make better high tech products like better search engines and better high end chips and smartphones and whatever. So Brazilian industry can never compete on that end either. So Brazil ends up importing all its industrial products and doesn't end up creating any of them and developing the know-how and the expertise and the academic culture or whatever to really cultivate that further. The other part of it is a human capital thing that for these countries, there's often an argument that, again, the education is starting to fail the countries. They aren't really growing their human capital, building up skills, whether it's through the industrial skill set or through just like better schooling, better universities, things like that, to turn a larger portion of the population to high skilled workers that are capable of doing more advanced global service jobs or high tech, high end industrial jobs. So that one's particularly important in China because one thing that was brought up in class a lot is how that is part of the inequality in China. The more rural areas of China, the more Western areas, as in not just like Shanghai, Beijing and stuff like that, they're a lot poorer. Big inequality between those few coastal cities and the rest of China. And those poorer areas are in many ways poor, like the representative of poor country, even though the Shanghai is kind of representative of a very rich country. So in those poorer areas, you see like things like parasitic worms, you see a lot of health problems, and you see those health problems in children catalyze into worse educational outcomes, worse personal outcomes. And part of the worry from the Chinese perspective is that that sort of thing will inhibit those people from getting the necessary education to really build up their area of the country to make it into a modern era and kind of pull back a lot of China because the education system's not there, because the health system is not there, allowing children to prosper and stuff like that. So does that sort of make sense from the inequality from the that sort of middle income track perspective, I hope. Any questions on that? No? Okay, so moving on. Important to understand the relationship between inequality and growth. So basic idea is that when you're growing quickly, especially like some areas of your country are growing quickly and some areas are not growing yet, or they will grow, or whatever happening, is inequality going to go up during the high growth period, or is it going to go down?
It goes up.
It goes up, yeah, because when you're taking off, when you're really taking the jump from poor country to rich country, hopefully, you're going to have some areas start earlier, and that because the growth is just higher, that means the division between those more industrialized, those more urbanizing, richer, productive areas that are attracting all the good talent from everywhere else in the country, they're going to be growing like crazy, and the rest of the country is going to fall behind them. So inequality will increase. And also within cities, one expects during these high growth periods to see a bigger amount of inequality between like the elites and the average working person. The other important thing is that it can go down afterwards. So once growth starts to slow, the other places can catch up through just like natural, like they just started a bit later, or artificial, like the central government can use its state capacity to transfer and make sure those areas and those people can catch up with better education systems, like state schools, things like that throughout the country. Okay, full beans on that. Any questions? Okay, let's talk about next topic, human capital. We already touched on that a bit with the idea of like health issues, especially for children in rural areas, bringing down their education potential. Also, it's important to understand the effects of the one-child policy. Specifically, can somebody explain how that has changed the culture around sons, male children in China, quickly? Nathan?
Yeah, so because of the one-child policy, sons are more preferred than daughters. for the purposes of like marriage and work. So that ended up causing a disproportionate amount of sons born for every daughter born.
So yes, there's a preference to have male sons, to, because they think they'll get the jobs, they'll be able to take care of the family, they'll keep a legacy, whatever misguided notions in that regard. But there's also other sorts of distortions that come from preference regarding sons. Faz, you want to have something to add?
Doesn't the saving rate usually go up because families are kind of saving more money than they can give to the son to make them more appealing on the marriage market?
Yes. So again, taking the I don't know if that was like a clap or whatever.
No, okay, sorry. I was meant to raise my hand, but I accidentally did the.
What were you
clapping.
gonna add?
Oh no, I didn't mean to interrupt. But
Okay,
well, I guess what I was gonna add was there was, this isn't the table I wanted to bring up at the end, but like on one of the regression things, it did say that I think the indicators were like local sex ratio, so how many males to females, and that had a negative relationship with, like a slightly negative relationship with savings. So I took that to mean like, oh, like, well, just because you have like a local sex ratio that's bad, you might have like a girl, it's not an indicator for if you have a guy or not. So that's why it could be negative and like slightly negative or like close to zero. But then the sex ratio times the dummy variable for son gave you a very high relationship with savings. But then what I didn't understand was when you take out the sex ratio and just have an indicator for if you have a son or not, that gave a negative relationship with savings.
I need to see the paper and read the paper. Everything.
Okay, sorry.
I didn't follow everything. All I would say is just try, like, if we have time we can look at it, but try to just think about are there any sort of, what's the difference between those two ways of looking at the same issue, and are there some people who might be considered just based on whether they have a son versus the other group, such that it would change the relationship. But that is just something I will consider.
Okay.
What I was, so yeah, just we'll talk about that later. So yeah, the most important thing is the takeaway that again, the marriage market, parents really want their sons to get married because they want the wife to take care of the parents, and they want the son to have that stable thing. They care more about that than the daughters, because the daughters might end up taking care of the other guy's parents. So that doesn't really help them out that much. So again, not a hard and fast rule, but there seems to be a preference for saving for the son, giving them the right degrees, giving them the right car, those kind of things, so that they're attractive on the marriage market, especially because of the population, slight imbalance in the population towards males. Okay. Does that make sense, everybody? Thumbs up? Cool. A few thumbs, not many. Okay, next, I'm going to try to go quickly through these last topics. Let us consider the environmental implications. So quickly, what was the reason fighting pollution was so difficult in China? Still is, but was. Two main reasons, maybe more. Nathan?
I think one reason is because it was hard to measure. Another reason was that it wasn't being counted towards the tournament system. Like the officials' promotions weren't yet based on environmental impacts.
Okay, those are two great reasons. There's many, but two, firstly, was like that sort of research on like downstream measurements, like, it causes distortions. Like, you can measure river pollution, but then pollution will be higher downstream where it's not being measured past the monitoring station. There's also, so it's difficult to measure pollution in general, find the source of like just particulates in the air, things like that. It's also the whole idea that the tournament system is about growth, and energy is an engine of growth. Emissions are the engine of manufacturing. Random chemicals are involved in random processes, and thus that leads to when you're just preparing growth, it'll lead to smog, it'll lead to toxic gases, it'll lead to poison and carbon and whatever. But when you then that caused China to reconsider the promotion formula to not just be based on GDP growth, but to also include pollution targeting, so that they lowered pollution too, because of how bad the problem was getting in the big cities. Was becoming extremely bad, and it looked bad on the world stage. Okay, Isha, you want to add anything?
I was just gonna say the same like tournament thing. So
okay, and the last thing I would add on top of that is just the idea that developing countries, high growth rate, middle of their development cycle, you need a lot of energy. You're an industrial country, you need a lot of energy, and you care about industry. Industry involves all sorts of chemicals, all sorts of things that need to be emitted. So pollution in water, in air, in the ground, that's just going to happen in an industrial country that doesn't have the sort of which prides itself is built upon cheap labor to provide for the world. So if you start to have really expensive, low emission equipment, you're basically erasing the competitive advantage you have over some sort of factory in America and making low price goods. Okay, just quick on that is remembering the regression discontinuity RD design, just the idea like when you, like for example, you had the river, you looked at one side of the river in one province under one regulatory scheme, other side of the river, and then you kind of see that there's a sharp change, like further and further away from the river on one side, you see one general trend of life expectancy as a function of distance. Other side, you see a general trend that seems to line up. And then suddenly when you cross the river, you see a sharp change, a discontinuity. And that tells you that there's some effect of that policy potentially on the dependent variable, in this case, a policy on pollution on the dependent variable of life expectancy. Very quick thing. It's not the most important thing, but just understand that basic design. Okay, 9, let's talk about censorship. Why don't you ban censorship? What can you learn from why is it good to allow people to protest or to say things both verbally or online, in person or online? Isha, then Nathan.
I think it gives the government some information. Like one of the problems was the with autocracy is the information flow problem, because they don't have any elections to gauge like what the public's feeling. So protests allow them to get like mini taps into what the public is feeling and what they need.
Okay, yes, exactly. Protests are a window into what people care about, and China does react to them. I mean, like last time when we met, I said I was uncertain about how this would go, and I think we all were. Now it looks like China genuinely significantly altered its zero COVID strategy as a result, in reaction to the protests. This is something that actually happens. They need to know what people are still feeling to make sure that people don't bottle it up and to make sure that they don't get too angry at the government. You need some way to finger the pulse. Nathan, what do you want to add?
I was just going to say another thing for the censorship. Like the reason that they don't fully censor everything is because they prefer using like small nudges. So like, for example, I think for Google, like they throttled it so that 1 out of every 10 searches wouldn't work, stuff like that. It's like they use that kind of like soft censoring rather than a hard ban on any one thing.
People doing it by hand.
Yes, so there's a lot of reasons for soft censoring. Again, like what Nathan is saying, the idea, and also the idea that you can use propaganda to go against them. You can, again, get the idea of what people care about. You can confine these people. There's benefits in letting people vent a little bit, all sorts of things. And most importantly is like, just again, the idea of having some way of knowing what people care about. And as you can see, China does actually have like that sort of semi-democratic process if you want to reach for that. And they do have some level of reaction to what people want and care about. Okay, so there's that. Let's move on quickly to 10 political movements. So quickly, I just want to make sure that you understand that when it comes to political movements, lots of things going on in China. One is this idea of like you want some level of protesting possible. 2 is the idea that why do people go to these movements? This is kind of the Hong Kong thing. Remember, strategic substitutability in that paper, the idea that people who thought that few people were going to go to the protest, but then were told that way more people were going, they're like, oh, well, ton of people are going and I don't really need to go to that protest, rather than, hey, a lot of people are going, I should go, it'll be fun to go with them, I'll be safer. So it seemed like people were more like, hey, if a lot of people are going, then I don't need to go show my face. But if they overestimated, they're like 30% were going and instead it was just like 17%, they're like, oh crap, I need to go now, it's like really important I go. So that was the idea there. There's also the idea of the networking effects. You want to, if your friends are going, the people who live in your campus entryway are going, you're probably going to be a bit more likely to go. And lastly, why do you go? Like, I mean, there's plenty of reasons. You want to get something done. You want to help people. Some of the time it's just your friends are going. or you want to look like you're getting something done. You want to look like an activist or something. So it's about appearances, it's about friendships, social networking. It's all as well as about the actual idea you're proposing. Helen?
Yeah, quick question on that. I know we talked about how it's like not only about your friends, but also about like new social ties that you make. Can you walk through or just clarify how that paper, like I think they did it by like treatment density or treatment intensity, and they said like that was how we measured it, but I didn't totally understand why that specifically pointed out new social ties.
I don't have a perfect memory of this. My overall impression, at least what you need to know, is it just, again, the basic finding was in the vein of if more people around you went to the protests and stuff like that, you'd be more likely to go. Like, you know, so you'd be like, hey, let's like, all my friends seem to have gone, and they seem to have like all this stuff to say about it. I should probably go the next time. Because they were in that treatment group, and now you're like, hey, yeah, maybe I'll go with them. The new social tie thing, at least my conceptual understanding, is that it had to do with people who you met at the protest. But I remember that wasn't as important. They didn't find anything as clear on that. But I'll go back and look just to make sure. The more important thing to focus on was the stronger effect, was the idea of kind of peer pressure sort of thing. Everyone's talking about it, FOMO sort of effect, and then you end up going because all your block mates and all your entryway mates went to the protest, or all the people in your existing social circle went.
Gotcha. And so does that exhibit the next year, or does that exhibit the year of? Or both?
The most important thing is the next year in the context of the study, because people come back talking about it, telling the story, stuff like that. So that's part of the way of, I guess, interpreting that. It's not very clear. And the other thing is, like, you know, this was a study, so it's hard to measure the effect in the year of, because you're kind of assigning these kind of groups at first. But most important is the next year, coming back, talking about it, potentially making friends, but more importantly, your existing social circle being like peer pressured or motivated into it more so than a new social circle, which is hard to form, which is one protest at one random, like, you know, event over the year.
Gotcha. Okay. And then one other question, you mentioned it briefly earlier, but could you explain again why they did the subway placebo thing? Like-
Basic idea there is just that you have this experiment that's naturally going to, in like many economic experiments, you need to pay people to do what you want them to do. And that means the people who are going to sign up to it are not, who might not be just the average person who may or may not have gone to a protest. They might be much more motivated because of money, and they might be, that might cause other confounding effects. Like that might be they're more motivated by just getting by. That might be they're poorer, and that might have other implications on whether they would have gone to the protest or not. So you adjust for that by, rather than just comparing to people who are not given the money to like go to the protest and to do all this, take pictures of the protest, you compare it to people who are given money to go and looking at how often they go the next year. You also have a group, a placebo group, who has to go take pictures at a subway station. So still a group of people, still a crowded area, and then you measure how often they go to the protest. That way, in the next year. So that way you are comparing between two people that go do something you paid them to do, like go take pictures in a random location, and you're only really looking at those two very similar people who are both paid to do this thing, both motivated by the money. You're going to see, does actually going to the protest affect whether you go the next year or something like that? Not if you got paid. Does that distort it in some way?
Okay, so basically they, like in year one, they have like the subway group and then the protest group. And then what they're looking for is year two, if the subway people also go to protests. Is that correct?
Yes. Comparing whether the subway people go to protest versus whether the protest people go to the next protest.
Gotcha. So
if you want to really just
control
see
group-
what is the effect of the protest on wanting to go to protests in the futures and stuff like that. You don't want to see what is the effect of me paying you, or what is the effect of you just happening to be poorer and needing money and signing up for this study. You want those. You just want whether going to the protest affects it. You want to control the other stuff.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks.
Okay, so let's move on then. The last major topic There's a few small things I want to mention before you all leave. Last major topic is the ethnic and the China historical context. So again, understanding the regionalization of Chinese ethnic groups, Xinjiang, the Uyghurs, Tibet, Buddhists, and like, you know, the whole Dalai Lama thing, and a rather independent culture. Taiwan being people who are expats, people who literally fought a war and lost and escaped to the island in exile. Hong Kong, people who left much of the rest of China during especially the Cultural Revolution, especially wealthier people, so that they could have an area to set up their businesses and to live their more capitalistic lives. So very different groups of people concentrated in specific areas. Remember in class, Tibet yesterday, that was the first place that was sort of forcibly integrated. Hong Kong today, you're seeing how that's happened with the modern security policies, the reneging of the original agreements of when Britain handed over Hong Kong in 97, and Taiwan potentially next. So considering what Taiwan is seen as to China, is Taiwan a military target? Not really. Taiwan is not that useful for China militarily. Taiwan is a lot more useful for China as a political object, as a cultural object. It has an important heritage. You want to get back the land that was taken from you by the Japanese and the Americans and all these other places through the century of humiliation. We got Hong Kong back. We got Macau back. Taiwan is part of us. And we want to finish what we started. So culturally, it's a big cultural touchstone in China. It's a big part of the nationalist push in China. And also economically, like, I mean, that one I think is a bit more shaky, but if you get a peaceful unification with Taiwan, you get a major access to the most cutting edge of semiconductor and artificial intelligence chip manufacturing, which could be of major benefit in the coming decades. So that's what to consider from Taiwan. From a historical standpoint, remember those two broad periods. For millennia, China was the dominant power, no multipolarity, unipolarity. China dominated its area. Everybody else paid tribute to China. And so it was a big drop off when you come to the century of humiliation. You move far away from this whole thing where China is dominant, where they control everything, to this situation, the century of humiliation, where everything's being taken away by Western powers. They're being forced to open up. They lose a bunch of wars. They lose some major port cities. And then finally, they're being able to claw some of that back now. So understand that history of the Middle Kingdom, that position of superiority and all that sort of stuff. Okay, last few things I would recommend touching on in your review. And make sure you understand the innovation content, the slides on innovation. So we talked about most of what you need to know, but understand a helping hand, grabbing hand, understand why innovation might work better in China because of their local tournament system, how the tournament system might injure that in some ways. Also understand policy experimentation, go and review those slides, and understand the studies there, understand why it helps China, what it allows them to learn versus America, how the Chinese top-down control system and promotion system can make policy experimentation work better, but also some of the downsides, how it can be maybe slow, or how it can be biased to certain areas, how that's adjusted for, things like that. And how there's less feedback in China of whether policies are working well because there's no elections. Fez, what's your question?
Hey, so I know you talked about the distinction between grabbing hand and helping hand at the start of the session, but would you mind just doing that real quick one more time? Because
Most
I think
important,
I understand it, but I just want to make sure.
most important thing to understand, at least from my perspective, is grabbing hand, the idea of shoving down the others, shoving down the other people from operating in your area. Helping hand, more pulling up the people who are within your area. I would also consider it in the sense of like also like wanting things from other companies versus helping hand trying to give things to giving things to companies.
Perfect, that makes sense. Thank you so much.
Okay, and any other questions about innovation or policy experimentation? Those are important ones to cover. Okay. The other things I would recommend covering are understanding like the middle income trap and the one child policy, making sure you review those human capital sort of things, so you can understand the role of education, the role of health, all that sort of stuff, and have good arguments to make on that. And finally, be able to understand those papers I talked about, specifically the graphs. And more importantly, it's good, like the questions on empirical design aren't going to require you to know that many specifics, but you need to make sure you understand what you can conclude and what you can't conclude. So for example, can you conclude from, like, let's just say the AI-tocracy thing, can you conclude that political unrest leads to government wanting more surveillance technology? Yes, but you need to check for a few other things. Like, for example, are there other things that are happening at the same time? Are there confounding factors? Does the experimental design as described really show what it's trying to show? In the vice versa, like, does AI procurement lead to less unrest? Well, then you need some sort of control there. You need to make sure that it's only the surveillance AI procurement that is high procurement of that is causing or is followed by reduced unrest, is correlated with reduced unrest. Regular artificial intelligence that's not surveillance oriented, that shouldn't be correlated with that. If that is, then there's probably some other confounder going on that doesn't have to do with surveillance causing less unrest. It probably might just have to do with like richer places being able to afford AI and also being able to afford more police officers or something like that. So make sure you understand what you can infer about these things and what you can't. So do a close read of these graphs and ask yourself these questions, and be prepared to answer those sorts of questions like I just asked you. Okay, Robert, what's your question?
Yeah, sorry, can you just walk through one more time the different papers you recommend us looking into? I got AI-tocracy, the Hong Kong protest papers. What else, like, specific research do you recommend us look into and understand?
If somebody wrote down what I said and can type it in the chat, that would be good. But again, those are the most important in particular. But I would make sure to at least get a passing understanding, at least with this, like the slide deck and stuff like that, of the paper on the one-child policy savings rate for the marriage market, the research on apparently not a paper, but like just research on where industries show up. Are they showing up in the center or the edges of provinces because of competitions, princelings, things like that. So if somebody remembers what I exactly said, just write that in the chat. One thing I think somebody asked about the weather thing, at least I just quickly looked at this. To my understanding, the biggest takeaway there is you know that protests are going to happen generally on days with good weather. So basically it's a control for other sorts of influences. So if you just like look at days that have the fine weather dummy that have, like, okay weather, and then you look at whether there was an increase in procurement of public security or surveillance artificial intelligence, then you see less unrest. The takeaway there is, I think that, like, it's like my guess is what happened when they did this paper is they first just looked at public security, just like getting those surveillance tech. Then they were like, hey, there's no relationship here. And then they thought about it, and then they realized that there was some sort of confounding factor that was affecting the days, affecting protests. Like it might have been, for example, even just like during the observation period, there were more rainy days or something like that. And that caused just less protests overall. Or it was, maybe there was more nice days, more nice days, and that caused more protests overall or something, and it counteracted the effect. So I'm not exactly sure what happened here. He might have explained it in class, but that might have been why they ended up controlling to only deal with days that had good weather. Helen?
Sorry, 2 quick questions. You mentioned a savings rate paper. Can you repeat the title of that one again, or like the topic?
The topic would have been the one-child policy lecture. You don't need to understand it deeply. Just understand what Fez talked about, higher savings for male children because they need to get leg up in the marriage market. That's honestly enough. But if you want to take a look at the slides on human capital, the one-child policy, that sort of thing.
Gotcha. Okay. And then do we need to know the papers on like media censorship and stuff like that?
Media censorship.
Or sorry, like
Uh,
self-censorship.
uh,
Yeah,
what?
self-censorship, media censorship, yeah.
Understand the basic idea, like, I think it's a clever, design personally, for knowing like that whole idea of like asking people like to select from, like, count the number of options they agree to versus like actually checking the box and stuff like that. So understand the basic idea. Did everyone remember that, like, they had the you can check like your agreement or disagreement with certain things against the CCP, or you can just count the number of answers you agree with, and then you compare those numbers, and then you see that people, when they don't identify specific things, they're just counting, they're more willing to criticize the government. Other thing to have a vague understanding of is the research on the VPNs and the access to how accessing information abroad changes your perspectives. Remember, you needed that incentive. It couldn't just be you just give them access. That didn't really change anything. You needed to give them an incentive, like paying them to complete quizzes and stuff like that. And even if you did that, after a while, after you stopped, they still started using those sources more and started having more critical views of the Chinese government. Those are the main things to remember. Again, just do a brief review. You don't need to focus too heavily on that.
Okay, can you explain? I've never really understood the counting, like he said, like the 5 questions and the real
Yes.
question
So
is based within.
the basic idea is, so you have some questions that are just like neutral questions, like they don't really mean everything. You'd expect the control group and the treatment group to answer those the same way. So control group only gets those questions, the neutral questions. I think this is how it works. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the essence. They only get the neutral questions, not the politically sensitive ones. And so now you have a baseline for how many of these neutral questions on average everybody is saying yes to. So maybe there's like 10 neutral questions, and on average you just see regular people in China, no matter who they are, on average are going to say yes to like 4 of them. They're gonna add up to 4. So they're gonna, if you add all this thing, if they in their head they agree to 4 statements, of those 10, they're gonna report 4 in the control group. Now the treatment group, they might have 15 questions. They'll have those 10 basic questions, and then intermixed with them might be 5 politically sensitive questions. And now, if they agree to 2 of those politically sensitive questions, they're going to be like reporting the score of 6 on average, because they're going to agree to 4 of the politically insensitive ones, not the politically unsalient ones, and then 2 of the politically sensitive ones. So that way, you just literally subtract the treatment group that got those politically sensitive questions from the control group, which didn't, and you'll find the number of people who agree with those politically sensitive statements without them really knowing that you're able to identify that. However, when they had to check and like show like, hey, I agree with this statement that is critical, like cross the box, I agree with the statement that is critical of the Chinese Communist Party, when it was less anonymous, even though it was still anonymous, it was less anonymous. They were really putting their name next to it. They were less willing to criticize the CCP. That's the big finding there. That's the really clever procedure they used. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's really helpful. So I guess this is only for like agree or disagree questions, right? Like they have to say like true, false statements.
Yes, that's really how where this will work best. You could technically do it on like scales, like add up how much you agree with statements, but it's going to work worse. So this is mostly with agree or disagree.
Okay, and then like in your example, if they selected yes to 2 of the politically sensitive, you don't have a way of knowing like which 2 of the 5 they said yes to, right? You just kind of figure it out.
Yes, that is a good point. I'm pretty sure they had ways of doing that. Like one way might be to like give different treatment groups different of the politically sensitive questions. So that way, like you can cross look at like, which group had higher numbers, which groups had lower numbers, and then you can, do some combinations there to find what questions they were agreeing to.
I see. Cool. Thank you.
At least that's my guess to how they do it. I don't actually know. So any other questions on these stuff? Okay, last messages quickly are again, like those few things, like make sure to understand innovation, human capital, things like that, understand AI autocracy, and like the Hong Kong stuff. And if you followed most of what I said, you understand the concepts really well, you'll be able to answer the short answer easily enough. If you understand those research and the concepts of at least what I covered just now, you'll be pretty well set for the multiple choice too. But just review those targeted things. Right, any last things, comments, questions, jokes? No?
Tell us a joke, bro.
You have a joke?
No, you tell us a joke. You always have jokes.
Okay. Um, hmm. Um, um, no, that doesn't work. Okay, okay, give me a second. Who else had an actual question? Sorry, I'll think of a joke. Somebody had something they wanted to ask at the end. No one? Helen?
There's a joke in the chat.
There's a joke in the chat. Let's see it. The final will not be a joke, unfortunately. How about
Just to buy you more time, I actually thought of a question.
wait, what's your question?
How many, I know it said like 2 to 3 short answers. Does that include the experimental design thing, or is that a whole other, like, do those not count as the 2 to 3 short answer questions?
Oh, wait, what? Sorry?
Like on the practice exam, I think Professor Yang said that the short answer section would have 2 to 3 questions.
The short answer question section will not have 2 questions. It will have like 3 questions or 4 questions with multiple subparts. So it's a lot of questions. I tried to cut it down, me and the other TFs, but it's still kind of long. It is a lot shorter than it was. So again, that's why I'm saying go quickly, make sure you know the stuff in advance and write relatively short answers.
Okay, and is the experimental design thing baked within the short answer section?
Yes, it is probably about half of it.
Okay, sounds good.
Isha, what's your question?
This is less of a final question and more of like a grading question. Do you like how is like the grading cut down or breakdown on the syllabus what typically is used to, like, is that still correct? Like this is worth 35% of our grade. Is it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that should be accurate. So that should be about right. Yeah. Okay. The last joke is, how about this? I got a B on my Chinese economics final. Kind of stung. Okay, and with that, let us